Hello, my name is Gerry Vahe, and I'm a Principal Embedded Solution Engineer for Microchip technology. I will be going over Secure Boot and why it's increasingly important as a foundation of an embedded system. Microchip has a great overview presentation on cryptography. Some of the concepts in this presentation rely on terminology discussed in the primer. It is highly recommended that you watch this. What you will learn in this presentation. You will learn what is Secure Boot, why Secure Boot is important, the building blocks necessary to achieve Secure Boot, the best practices and methods to implement Secure Boot, and most importantly, design examples for both MCU, which are typically flash-based microcontrollers, and MPU, processor-based microcontrollers that typically boot from an external serial SPI flash. An important disclaimer: the products discussed in this presentation to implement Secure Boot do not encompass the entire list of security products Microchip provides. What is Secure Boot? Secure Boot ensures that only trusted and authentic firmware runs on the embedded system. As I show here, a foundation is extremely important when building a garage or a house to ensure stability of the structure. In this case, Secure Boot is the security foundation for an embedded platform. It can help also form a hardware root of trust. This is accomplished by using something called digital signatures, which we will get into briefly in a minute. The hardware root of trust Secure Boot platform can manage other things such as secure firmware updates, key revocation, which is basically if a key pair is compromised, you can revoke the keys, and then firmware rollback. If someone tries to put an older version of software on the platform, it will stop this from running because there could be security problems with the older version of the firmware. I thought it was appropriate to provide a quick overview of digital signatures. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, Microchip has a cryptography primer presentation. That goes into many more details of digital signatures. The overview I'll provide here applies mostly to Secure Boot. Cryptographic digital signatures assure authenticity and integrity of the firmware running on the target. In Secure Boot, the asymmetric method of authentication is preferred over symmetric. In Secure Boot, one of the first steps is to generate a private public key pair, and that is done using something called a hardware security module. The hardware security module is something that typically sits in a data center, on a rack, in a room under lock and key, where the engineer may never even see this piece of equipment. It may be logged into remotely, and only one person may even have access to this piece of equipment remotely. But once those public-private key pairs are generated, the next step is to send the firmware that was developed for the embedded system to the HSM to generate an ECDSA signature using the private key. ECDSA stands for Elliptic Curve Digital Signature Algorithm. Once this is done and the HSM generates this signature, the firmware, the public key, and the signature are now delivered to the embedded system. Keep in mind, the reason that the HSM is under lock and key and is secure is because it contains the private key used to do all these steps and the public key that is related to that private key. I wanted to give a closer view of the process on how digital signatures are used to verify integrity and authenticity of the firmware running on an embedded system. More importantly, what happens where? When firmware is developed and ready to be deployed, an HSM is used in manufacturing to do the following. The firmware is sent through typically a SHA-256 algorithm to derive a hash or a digital fingerprint. What's interesting is regardless of if the firmware is 200 bytes or 200 megabytes, the result of this operation is the same size, 256 bits. In addition, if one bit is changed, this value will be different. The private key that was generated on the HSM and the hash are input into something called an ECDSA sign operation. The result of this operation is a signature. As mentioned earlier, the signature, the public key that corresponds to the private key, and the firmware are delivered to the embedded system. On the target or the end device, the bootloader stored in the flash is responsible for doing the following. Just like on the HSM, the firmware is passed through the same algorithm, in this case a SHA-256, and a hash or a digital fingerprint is produced. Keep in mind, if there's a flash error or an intentional hack of 1 bit, this hash will be different. I also want you to note that I have this legend on the right side, and I say typically calculated by the MCU. This is typical, but not always. And why I say that is you might be doing this on a very low-powered microcontroller that doesn't have a hardware block to do the SHA-256 algorithm, which could increase the boot times. If you offload this to our crypto elements, such as the ATECC608, this can help with boot times on a smaller microcontroller. In addition, the public key is also stored in the crypto element. The reason for this is it's okay that a public key can be seen, but it can't be changed. If you could change the public key, then the whole operation can be hacked, and that's not what we want. The signature that was passed on from the HSM, as well as the hash and the public key, goes into something called the ECDSA verify operation. This is a firmware intensive operation, so typically this is calculated by the crypto element, just like the SHA-256 algorithm could be, but this is even more calculation intensive. So the crypto element is a great device to do this. When this verify happens, you get a yes or no answer, and the bootloader will make a decision whether or not to execute the firmware that was in the flash. Why is secure boot important? Many years ago, it seemed as though smart thermostats started a trend, meaning that they are connected to Wi-Fi. This totally makes sense to me. However, it seems as though now everything is connected to Wi-Fi. Take a look at this picture. This is a picture of a washing machine that I bought about a year ago. Unfortunately, it seems as washing machines don't last much more than 10 years anymore. So I can easily remember 10 years back when I shopped for a washing machine. I can almost guarantee you there were no washing machines connected to Wi-Fi unless they were extremely high-end. Now, it seems as the run-of-the-mill mainstream units are connected to Wi-Fi and only the basic ones aren't. To be honest with you, the smart thermostats make sense, but a washing machine, I don't understand it. I think the drawbacks are much higher than the benefits. If it folded your clothes and put them in and took them out and did all that for you, yeah, maybe it would make sense, but it doesn't. So the benefits, I think the drawbacks, like I said, outweigh the benefits. And the drawback is it's sitting on Wi-Fi. It can be hacked. It's connected to water lines in your house. What would happen if a hacker was able to hack LG and be able to flood your house and many more houses? That is one of the examples of why secure boot is important. State the goal. What are you trying to protect? The picture in this slide may date me. These devices were popular in the 80s and 90s, and I admit I had one. They were put on the steering wheel to deter a theft of your car. Point being is, if you have two cars of equal value and one has this device on the steering wheel and one doesn't, what car will get stolen? You should assume that with enough time, equipment, and motivation and funds, security can be bypassed. So as a designer, you must determine what you're trying to protect, what and who you're attempting to protect against, and most importantly, what is the threat vector? For example, if someone has hardware and it's in their possession, they have a lot of time to hack that. So, for example, it's probably a good idea that, hey, they could hack that device, but make sure it doesn't affect the other devices that you're selling. There could be supply chain threats. You send your devices to a third party to manufacture. What happens if there's an adversary inside of that manufacturing company and they do some sort of a threat? And then probably the worst one of all is a cyber attack. Again, they don't have the hardware in their possession, but they can get to these devices pretty easily over the internet if the correct measures are not put in place. So here are two MCU-based products that have a very different answer to what we're protecting. I think the first picture is self-explanatory. Obviously, it's a drill. Some of the most common newer drills that are battery powered typically have an MCU in most cases to do the motor control or do the lights and authentication with a battery, things like that. To be honest with you, in most cases, these are not usually firmware updated. And again, these are going to be cases that can probably be proved wrong, but this is most cases. They're usually not connected, although I'm sure some are connected via Bluetooth now and all of those things. There's low risk of a malicious firmware attack. The worst case that happens is it turns on. I mean, I guess there could be hacks that ruin the battery or start fires and things like that, but this is just an example. Point being is there's a low monetary risk of firmware getting hacked in the drill. On the other side, I have what looks like a USB key, and that's why there's titles on these. It's a hardware crypto wallet. Once again, this could have the same MCU as the drill has. This is mostly updated all the time via the internet, via Bluetooth or USB. The third bullet is it could have more than your salary or more than your retirement in dollars stored in it. This device could easily be lost or stolen. And not to mention, hacking one unit can result in a huge monetary loss. So these are two examples that have very different approaches to security. Here's another example. This time it's processor based. This is my actual Dell PowerEdge R730 server that I took apart to kind of illustrate a few things here. Most importantly, usually servers have something called a BMC, which is a board management controller. This is typically running an open source firmware such as U-boot for the bootloader and Linux as an operating system. I point this out because those are known operating systems. There's a lot of expertise in these areas. So more expertise, more power equals more hackability. This CPU is typically a higher end ARM CPU, such as our SAM A5 Cortex MPU or our A7 system on a chip. This BMC not only manages the fans and all of those things, but it manages OS updates, and it's the first CPU on the platform to boot. The other thing that you'll notice is the server typically has an x86 processor. It has its own Ethernet ports, PCI Express ports, all of that. But the BMC also has its Ethernet ports, serial ports, VGA ports. If this thing is wired incorrectly or, not implemented correctly, the Ethernet could be open to the internet. Kind of that's happened on hacks before. Not for nothing, but these servers run banking, pharmacy, drug companies, you name it. Amazon Web Services. There's so many things that these servers are sitting on. So we need to protect what's on it. I talked a lot about a whole bunch of security features, but my point being here is don't just take our word for it. There are a lot of standard bodies that are requiring or suggesting secure boot and update. Most of these are suggestions. Here's a list to name a few. Those were guidelines before, but then there's actually 2 states that have their own mandates or security IoT laws. I suspect more states are going to start implementing some of these in the future, but that's just my thought. This is a great video from the National Institute for Standards of Technology. It's about 7 minutes long, but it really points out the need for security. I figured I'd include it here because it was a good watch. I wanted to put a slide in here on common threats and possible countermeasures for those threats. This is mainly for reference. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but I do want to point out a few things. I talked about our crypto authentication devices in some prior slides. We also have some assisted boot processors, such as our CEC 1712 and CEC 1736. These are processors that help do secure boot root of trust on devices such as the server that I talked about that have processors that boot with external spy flash. One of the threats of external spy flash is if you replace it at the exact right time during the boot process, you could hack that system. So one of the newer features on one of these devices is that it real-time monitors the external spy flash and compares it against a signature to prevent an attack such as this. There are some other ideas, such as the micro with debug tool write inhibit. Sometimes locking off the boot ROM or the ROM inside of a microcontroller is very important because you don't want that boot code to change. Otherwise, it can be hacked. One other really neat feature of our crypto devices, as you can see down here on the remote attack example, it's something called persistent latch. That means if that ECDSA signature match doesn't happen, it will not unlock multiple more keys for cloud authentication. So this is another great feature that I wanted to point out. I wanted to bring your attention to some features that are essential to having a successful secure boot. As mentioned in prior slides, there are different levels of security depending on what you're trying to protect. One of the first steps of a root of trust is to ensure that the first code that executes is a trusted entity to the designer. For example, the bootloader is doing some important things to make sure that the application that runs is actually the application of intention. The bootloader code should be immutable, meaning it cannot change. Some of our lower cost, earlier MCUs have a very simple feature to disable JTAG from reading internal memory and preventing self-writes. This is fine for simple products that are not connected to the internet or have a very low value of hacking. However, some of our more advanced MCUs have much more advanced features. Some features that basically turn the flash into a ROM, meaning it's very hard to change the code inside of there, meaning the bootloader will do exactly what's intended. Here are some additional building blocks of secure boot that can help with your success. In asymmetric secure boot, public keys are public, meaning that anyone can read them. However, they must be immutable, otherwise someone can replace the key with their own and run nefarious code. With secure boot, our crypto authentication devices and trust anchors such as the AT-ECC 608 and TA100 can help with both ECDSA verify acceleration as well as secure immutable key storage. This is important when doing TLS authentication when you may need to store a private key. The main point of this last bullet is using a crypto authentication device just for secure boot is kind of a waste. You should use it in conjunction with other features of this device. I kind of think of Microchip's crypto authentication devices as a Swiss Army knife for different things such as node authentication and secure key private storage. I also mentioned this in the possible countermeasures. If ECDSA secure boot is successful, then and only then you unlock the private symmetric key for secure communications to the cloud. On this, I just wanted to show a basic block diagram of an MCU, bootloader application paired up with a crypto authentication device such as the AT-ECC 608 or TA100. Once again, over I2C, the micro talks to this crypto authentication device to do the ECDSA verify operation, which can be very intense for a small microcontroller. And then, and only then, will it allow the bootloader to continue to boot the application. This can also be used for a DFU or a device firmware update to make sure that the firmware being loaded to this device is authentic. The other note that you see here is I/O protection. A lot of times people will ask, well, I can see the traffic and replay the traffic on the I2C device. Well, our I/O protection secret will allow this not to happen, and it will encrypt the communications over the I2C. Every device will have its own I/O protection secret and be paired to the crypto authentication device. So if someone hacks one, they don't hack all of them. I wanted to give a summary of the benefits of using a secure element with an MCU. Here are some of the features that the secure element can help you with. Immutable key storage, such as public keys. Active shield for invasive attack protection. These devices actually have hardware features to protect against hacking, such as supply voltage tampers, temperature tamper detection, which are all hardware ways to try to hack this IC and to get the keys out of it. I also mentioned this device is a Swiss Army knife for security. You can store private keys for TLS, node authentication, and only unlock them if a successful ECDSA signature verification happens. On the ATECC 608, that's up to ECDSA 256. We also have our TA 100 that not only goes up to ECDSA 384, but also has GPIO to do things if something correct happens. That is, to hold a processor in reset or signal some other device that someone's trying to hack something. I also wanted to put an example in of the platform root of trust controllers we have, such as the CEC 1712 and CEC 1736. This device protects items such as the BMC that we talked about earlier in the server that runs in banks and things like that. If you notice, the processor has a reset line and SPI lines going from it to the CEC 1736, and then the SPI flash is connected to the 1736. There's a reason for that, which we will talk about in a little while. In this case, when the power is turned on to the system, the immutable boot ROM holds the processor through that line in reset and examines the SPI flash that's connected to the processor. It does the exact same thing that we talked about earlier with the crypto element in the MCU. It does an ECDSA verify function of the firmware that's running, that is intended to run in the SPI flash. Then, and only then, if that verify happens, it will release the processor from reset and allow it to run that code. There's a reason that the SPI flash runs through the processor. In our earlier device, the CEC 1712, the SPI flash was connected to the processor and to our platform root of trust controller. However, there's a vulnerability called time of check to time of use that can come up. And that is that a threat actor can swap the code source immediately after the code is authenticated and the reset line is released. In that case, the processor could execute malicious code from an alternate source. The 1736 closed that vulnerability because it also holds a golden copy of the code that is intended to boot externally and performs a runtime compare as the processor executes it. Here are some of the benefits of using one of our platform root of trust controllers, such as the CEC 1712 or CEC 1736. You can add secure boot to SPI-based flash booted processors. You can do a real-time runtime monitor of the SPI bus. You can add device firmware update verification. You can have a unique identity with PUF technology or random number generation in the case of the 1736. You can do key revocation and firmware rollback management, all managed by the 1712 or 1736. In summary, Microchip provides many products to help achieve secure boot. There are the secure elements we talked about, such as the ATECC 608 and TA 100 that can be paired with any microcontroller. And then there's also the platform root of trust controllers such as the CEC 1736 to protect a processor booted via SPI flash. Microchip has additional devices which support secure boot that are not described here, such as FPGAs and ARM Cortex MPUs. There are also data center products such as PCI Express switches and flash controllers. Please talk with your local sales or technical contact and they will get you in touch with a local security specialist. Thank you very much for attending this presentation. I hope it was useful to you.